Welcome to the Exhibit A podcast.
3, 2, 1, we are on. Hello and welcome to Exhibit A. Today we are talking about a very serious issue, and that issue is the case of women or men who are victims of domestic violence being forced to live with the perpetrators due to the stay-at-home orders. And now this might sound far-fetched, but it's a very serious issue. And I'd like to invite to you or introduce to you Debbie and Brooke. Debbie, how are you doing today?
Hi, everyone. Good.
And Brooke, how about you?
Yeah, well, thank you.
Okay. Well, before we get into the serious part of this, I want to mention something. I've done several of these podcasts by way of Zoom, and I think that this new era that we're heading into, because this is probably going to change our culture a little bit. We're going to be like communicating a lot with these things, even after the stay-at-home orders are in place. I think that there's going to be a new fashion trend. I think that people are going to be concerned about from here to here and that not worry about anything else. Do you agree, Brooke?
Oh, definitely. I am in sweatpants, but a nice shirt. So
I called you out on it. Good.
Yeah.
But, it's going to be all about the earrings and the fancy mustaches, right? And lipstick color. So just for the sake of that, what I thought is I'd put on maybe a hat or something, and it's going to be about the hat, right? Or something like that. Actually, I won't do this. I did have the courage to walk to work like this today, but I won't wear it for this podcast. So
I think you're onto something.
You know what? Maybe we could start a company, man, about new fashions, I love it. Hairstyles, weird hairstyles. Okay, so what we know about the stay-at-home order is that it's changing a lot of things about society. One of the things that it's changing, and I can't believe this, but crime has just completely dropped in America. I think that you probably read the same articles that I've read. In Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, crime rate is substantially down. There's less burglaries, less car thefts, less petty theft, robberies, everything's down. And it's obvious why. It's, because people are at home and they're kind of watching their stuff. Debbie, do you think that those statistics are true, or is this something that people are just making up?
No, I think they're definitely true. Plus, I think that robbers are less inclined to go into homes because they know that everyone is home and their chances of getting away without being caught or being seen are slim to none.
Yeah. And Brooke, with respect to that, the fact that we're seeing crime rates plummet, I believe that maybe that's another incentive for more stay-at-home work, type of thing. Maybe in the future, because of what's going on and we have a cultural change, maybe there'll be a positive about all of this. What do you think?
Well, I think you're onto something, and I agree. I've actually read some articles just about how there's probably no going back to the way things were before, after all of this happened. We're now all equipped to work from home, or we're becoming more equipped to work from home. And I don't think people want to go back to business as normal. And if we're seeing these drops in crime, these good benefits, why would we go back?
Right. Well, in spite of the fact that all these crimes are dropping, there's one crime that isn't dropping, right? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Debbie, as you know, the reports right now is that there's an increase in domestic violence throughout America due to the stay-at-home orders. Why do you think that's the case?
I think that, first of all, economic factors have always been a trigger for domestic violence, even outside of this coronavirus pandemic. So now that more people are unemployed and incomes are dropping, there's even more arguments and disputes about finances that I think could lead to incidents of domestic abuse.
Brooke, what do you think about that?
Well, I read an interesting article. LA is calling their stay-at-home order safer at home. And it was interesting because while we might think we're all safer at home, maybe from this pandemic, there are a lot of people out there who are victims of domestic violence where home is not a safe place. And I think that's why we're seeing this rise in domestic violence. There's nowhere for these victims or survivors to go. They're stuck. They have less outlets. They have less opportunities to seek help from, their family members or friends. So I think that's what is attributed to it, along with the economic factors, as Debbie pointed out.
Yeah. Debbie, from experience of working in family law for as many years as you have, that there's certain busy seasons for family law matters. It always seems to be either what months are the busy seasons?
Summertime is usually the highest.
Yeah, and that's really when we see that people are spending a lot of time together. They're on vacation, kids are out of school, and then I think it's January and February, there's a spike as well. And I believe that's probably because of right after the holidays.
Yeah.
Do you think that maybe people shouldn't spend so much time together, Debbie?
I think if spending time together leads to an increase in inevitable domestic abuse, then we should probably work toward remedying that. I think that what's interesting is that many victims of domestic abuse end up staying in those relationships due to economic factors. So it's not necessarily the other way around. Whereas now, because of the drop in income and availability to work, that's resulting in domestic abuse. But we also have seen it the other way around, that because people don't have anywhere else to go, or because of the domestic abuse, they're afraid to go out and start on their own. And
yeah, I agree. You know what I think is that the fact that people are staying together is just one part of the puzzle. But this is a very strange scenario where people are being forced into kind of like an extended vacation, but with no money. I mean, there's that financial stress. And Debbie, you already mentioned this, but the financial stress is a big cause of people breaking up and going through divorce. So in this case, do you think it's more about the finances or about the fact that people are living together and not being able to leave their homes?
I think it's both. I think those are two very big prevalent factors right now. But I think one thing that's important for everybody to recognize is that while the courts are closed, they are still open for emergency matters, and that includes domestic violence restraining orders. And those restraining orders are not only orders to keep people apart from each other, but also allow us to ask for spousal support, child support, and even attorney's fees. There's another thing that those restraining orders are helpful for, and that's that the court can order the perpetrator of domestic abuse to leave the home, despite the safer at home orders that we're under right now. And that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who's paying the rent or the mortgage, and in fact, it doesn't even matter how title is held. Or if the parties are or are not married. So that tool of a domestic violence restraining order is actually very helpful and still accessible to our community.
Yeah, you brought up a good point I didn't even think about is that there is still the potential of getting exclusive use of the family residence when there's violence. Obviously, if there's a restraining order, the perpetrator or the alleged person is going to be forced to leave. Very interesting. Brooke, so in this situation where people are victims of domestic violence, they're in the middle of it. They're told that they're supposed to stay at home, not go out to the park, not go running anywhere else. They're supposed to be there, yet they're victims of domestic violence. They're in the middle of it. What should they do?
I think there's a couple things they can do. Obviously, our office, for example, is open. There are still essential services that are open, such as other shelters. I also know that domestic violence organizations are trying to set up sort of, quote, remote help. They're doing these sort of Zoom advocacy, Zoom therapy sessions, and the hotlines are still always available. I think where trouble starts to come in, though, is if you're stuck at home and you're not thinking about leaving, you're not able to have these confidential conversations that these organizations are, putting on for you. I actually read an article today that France is starting to put domestic violence advocates or organizations around supermarkets, so that if the victim is going to the supermarket for that 1 hour they are able to leave the house, there's someone there that they can go talk to and hopefully come up with a plan of attack that way. So I think you definitely have to be more strategic. I did look up some tips for victims of domestic violence that how they should be dealing with this stay-at-home order. They should always be staying near an exit if possible, and they should always have a go bag ready in case they are able to leave the home and come maybe to our office or seek out help elsewhere. So those are just practical tips that I was made aware of.
Awesome. Well, I'm learning something as I'm talking to you ladies. You guys really did your research. So Debbie, what other tips would you give these victims of domestic violence while they're in the heat of it?
One really good tip is to always keep your cell phone charged in case you need to call 911 or call for help or in the event of an emergency. Another tip is to keep any relevant documents in order or at least handy. So if you need to just leave, you have access to all of those relevant and necessary documents. One really good tip to know at all times is where your abuser keeps his or her weapons. If you anticipate an incident of domestic abuse, if you know that it just happens every Friday evening or something like that, maybe you want to move those weapons or put them in a place where your abuser can't access them as easily. So in anticipation.
Well, those are good. Now, you told me before we started the program that there's also a secret code. I've seen, these things on the news reports where people are calling the 911 and talking to the dispatchers and giving kind of like a hint that they're being violated. You had a different, I guess it's not a different take, but some additional things that victims could do in that order. What is it?
Yeah, I actually read an article earlier today, also in France, at maybe one of those pop-up domestic violence resource centers, that they have a code word. I think it's, excuse me, mask 19, where victims of domestic abuse can tell the pharmacist and just they sort of know that means that I'm in trouble and I need help. So send help without actually having to disclose it. So in some instances, perpetrators of domestic abuse accompany their victims to the pharmacy and to the grocery store. They're not alone. They're not left alone. So in that sense, it would be, I think, a good idea for a community to come up with sort of code words or a shortened language like that or something to give us the chance to identify when domestic abuse is occurring and how we can stop it.
Okay.
Yeah. Dawn, if you don't mind, I'd love to piggyback off of that, just because I also read a similar article where people are now advised to set up sort of like standing phone calls with family members, if that's possible, to sort of daily check-ins, so they can make sure that, if there's a history of domestic violence, the victim is safe. And during those phone calls, there should be some sort of set up code word. It can be very simple, where if you mention it, the person you're speaking to is aware that, things are not going well and, help should be sent or something like that.
Very good. Very good. So, there's some of the old-fashioned things too, I think, such as we should encourage victims to take photographs of things that are going on, either injuries or damage around the house. Debbie, as you know, there's a lot of times there's physical evidence, like holes in the wall or broken lamps and things like that. Keeping journals, victims should continue keeping journals. They should try to escape, and then of course there's the old try to defend yourself, and stuff. Debbie, do you have any idea why we don't preach more that victims of domestic violence should be taking self-defense classes or trying to defend themselves?
Why they shouldn't be taking self-defense classes?
You just don't hear people talking about that as one of the things on the list, and I recently saw this thing about Dirty John, the episode where at the end, the bad guy was trying to really kidnap or maybe even kill the ex-wife's daughter, and she fought back and she was able to really defend herself. And, that's one of the things we don't see on the list these days is that, fight back for God's sake. You said know where the perpetrator's weapons are, but what about, thinking ahead of time, what will you do physically to fight back?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I think the more that we can do to empower ourselves and protect ourselves against domestic abuse, and even learning what the warning signs are of domestic abuse are, taking all of those steps, teaching our youth about domestic violence is important to help stop that cycle.
Yeah, I agree. So Brooke, one of the things that I've learned recently is that obviously the domestic violence shelters are like overcrowded now, and they're having to resort to some very creative things. There's also a problem that people aren't donating. So there's like a problem with no place to put victims of domestic violence, and they don't have the resources that they normally do because people don't have money to donate. Have you read about any of the ways that they're trying to solve these problems?
I think it's sort of what we're all trying to do in our professional lives, and starting to try to make it more, I think people are trying to set up more remote ways to help. I don't know how successful that is. And I think we were all sort of, not prepared for what's happening. And so we're all a little bit behind the ball, whether that's advocacy groups or, even our office, which has very quickly, risen to the occasion, but it took some time. I know that some of the other problems that are happening, not just because there aren't places for victims to go, shelters are overrun, is victims who do go to the hospital, often advocates are called to the hospital to help the victim. They're not doing that anymore because of the safety concerns for both the hospital staff as well as the advocates coming in. So, this problem with domestic violence and the consequences that COVID-19 are having on victims are, it's so complex and very layered, and it's not, it's not, like I said, there's many layers to it that you wouldn't think of to begin with.
Yeah, you really thought this through. I didn't really even think about it, but even the shelters weren't ready for this. I mean, who was? But, this is going to happen again someday. We're going to have more situations probably, and it's a lesson for all of us. So Debbie, we're running out of time. I think that we've exhausted the topic somewhat. What are your final words that you would like our audience to know about this particular situation, and maybe any tips that you give them?
Yeah, there is one thing that I wanted to add. If you are a victim of domestic abuse, or you anticipate becoming a victim of domestic abuse, the law does not allow us to record one another in our own homes. So that's not legal to record your partner or a parent or someone who you're living with in their own home. However, if you anticipate becoming the victim of domestic abuse, there is a provision that allows for a recording with the intent of using that to support your request for a domestic violence restraining order. So in addition to doing all the things that we always advise our clients and others, like taking photographs, like notifying witnesses, keeping journal entries, taking pictures of your injuries or injuries to property, walls, and things like that, if you expect that an incident of domestic abuse is going to occur, for that reason, you can record what otherwise would be a private conversation.
Yeah, you're talking about the preservation of evidence, and then I think that's a really important point. I recently did a case, or handled a case where my client went to the external and internal cameras on the house and was able to download the footage before it was erased. And I would say that it was really important that the date and time, if you could have that on there, if it's possible as well, as stamped on the video. But that's right, collecting evidence is very important. Brooke, your final words?
Yes, I think one of the overarching themes just in general society right now is that we should be checking in on everyone, even though we might not be able to do it physically. And I think that is especially important for people that we think might be victims of domestic violence. I'd also want to point out that children can be the victims of domestic violence. And now that they're not in school, a lot less reports are being made about those children because the teachers aren't there, obviously, to see what's going on. So everyone should be checking in on their friends, their neighbors, to the best of their abilities, because not everyone is going to be able to reach out for the help that they might need. And so they might need you even when we're socially distancing.
Absolutely. Debbie, thank you very much. And Brooke, you were fantastic again. And thank you for being so prepared. You certainly did your research. So thanks to our audience for joining us on Exhibit A, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, ladies.
Thank you.
For more information, visit us at PasadenaLawOffice.com.
Get help today. Call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233 or visit thehotline.org/help.